There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the deep timber of the Pacific Northwest. It isn't the absence of sound, but rather a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from a million microscopic noises. The ceaseless, rhythmic drip of condensation falling from ancient Sitka spruces, the damp squelch of decaying ferns, and the low, throaty groan of centuries-old wood shifting in the wind. It's a silence that presses against your eardrums until they ache. I used to think of it as a peaceful silence. I used to think this forest was a sanctuary. My name is Elias Vance. For the past 4 months, I have been the sole occupant of Watchtower 9, a 70-foot steel and timber needle piercing the canopy of the Olympic National Forest. Before this, I spent 8 years doing search and rescue, SAR, out of Seattle. I was the guy you called when a weekend hiker twisted an ankle on Mount Rainier, or when a family got turned around on a marked trail. I was good at my job because I understood the logic of the wilderness. The woods were governed by rules: gravity, weather, predators, and prey. If you respected the rules, you survived. But I came to Blackwood Ridge because I needed the rules to be simpler. I came here to forget the face of a 7-year-old girl named Maya, whom I didn't find in time last winter. I came to be alone with the trees, hoping the crushing isolation would eventually numb the guilt. The Forest Service was happy to put me up here. It's a remote quadrant, 50 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a brutal 2-day hike or a helicopter drop. My job was simple: watch for wildfires, report the weather, and maintain the perimeter trail. For the first 3 months, the isolation was a balm. The routine saved my mind. Wake at dawn, boil cowboy coffee on a propane stove, radio the daily sector report to the base station down in Port Angeles, chop wood, and hike the 10-mile loop around the ridge. But as the relentless autumn rains set in, turning the forest floor into a primordial soup of mud and rotting cedar, the atmosphere began to shift. The woods didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. They felt like a cage. It started exactly a week ago, on a Tuesday that barely saw the sun. The mist was so thick it swallowed the base of my watchtower, leaving my cabin floating in a sea of gray vapor. I had geared up for my afternoon perimeter check: heavy waxed canvas coat, waterproof boots, a survival knife strapped to my thigh, and my grandfather's .30-06 bolt-action rifle slung over my shoulder. The rifle was technically against park regulations for a standard patrol, but Blackwood Ridge had a healthy population of cougars and black bears. You didn't walk these woods unarmed, not if you had half a brain. The trail was steep, winding down from the rocky precipice of the ridge into the valley floor known as the Sink. It was old growth down there, a chaotic cathedral of towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks, their trunks strangled by thick parasitic moss. The canopy was so dense that twilight reigned even at noon. About 3 miles into my patrol, the first rule of the wilderness was broken. I was navigating a treacherous section of the trail, stepping over a massive deadfall, when I smelled it. It was a putrid, eye-watering stench that hit me like a physical blow. It smelled of sulfur, spoiled meat, and something else. Something sweet and metallic, like old copper coins soaking in stomach acid. I pulled my bandana up over my nose, my hand instinctively dropping to the cold steel of my rifle bolt. A bear kill, I rationalized. A grizzly had taken down a Roosevelt elk and left the carcass to rot. But as I pushed through a thicket of sword ferns, the rational part of my brain short-circuited. There was a clearing ahead, bathed in a sickly, diffused light filtering through the fog. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient western red cedar, its trunk wider than a pickup truck. Suspended roughly 20 feet in the air, impaled on a massive, jagged, broken branch, was a full-grown buck. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I had seen animal kills. I had seen the brutal, messy handiwork of mountain lions and packs of feral wolves. This was none of those things. A mature buck weighs upwards of 200 pounds. No cougar could drag a carcass of that size 20 feet straight up a sheer, branchless trunk. No bear could hurl it with enough force to impale it through the ribcage on a thick wooden spike. I approached cautiously, the crunch of my boots on the damp pine needles sounding deafening in the unnatural quiet. As I got closer, the sheer impossibility of the scene twisted my stomach into knots. The buck hadn't just been killed, it had been dismantled. Its hind legs were twisted and broken at impossible angles, tied together with thick vines. Its belly had been sliced open with surgical precision, the entrails completely removed. The hollow cavity of its chest was scraped entirely clean. But it was the head that made a cold sweat break out across my neck. The buck's neck had been snapped and twisted completely backward. It was staring down at me, and its eyes were gone. In the empty, bloody sockets, someone or something had wedged two smooth, perfectly round white river stones. "Jesus Christ," I whispered to the empty forest. My voice sounded thin, brittle, completely swallowed by the damp air. I scanned the tree line, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I brought the rifle to my shoulder, peering through the scope, sweeping the perimeter. The dense brush, the hanging moss, the deep shadows between the trees, everything looked like a hiding place. Everything felt like a threat. Then I noticed the silence. It wasn't the normal quiet of the deep woods. It was the Oz effect. Every seasoned outdoorsman knows it. It's when the forest goes completely, unnaturally dead. The insects stop buzzing, the ravens stop calling, the wind seems to hold its breath. It happens when an apex predator enters the area. The entire ecosystem freezes in pure, unadulterated terror. I was not the apex predator in this clearing. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. The stench was suffocating now, clinging to my clothes, burning my sinuses. I kept my rifle raised, my finger resting gently against the trigger guard. I needed to get back to the tower. I needed to get on the radio and call the Rangers down in Port Angeles. Tell them there was a sick poacher in the area, someone deranged enough to mutilate animals for sport. That was the logical explanation. A human mind broken and twisted, playing sick games in the wilderness. I turned and began to hike back up the trail, moving at a brisk, forced pace. I didn't run. Running triggers the chase instinct in predators. You never run. But the forest had changed. The topography felt slightly shifted, like a familiar room where the furniture had been moved an inch to the left. The shadows stretching across the trail seemed too long, too jagged. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Every rustling fern sounded like creeping footsteps. About a mile from the Watchtower, the second rule broke. I was climbing a steep incline, my thighs burning, my breath pluming in the cold air. The fog was thickening, reducing visibility to less than 30 yards. Out of the white mist, I heard a sound. Crack! It came from my left, deep in the thicket, a heavy branch snapping under substantial weight. I froze, dropping to one knee, bringing the rifle up. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to sound authoritative. "This is Ranger Vance with the Forest Service. Identify yourself." Silence. The fog swirled lazily between the dark trunks. Then I heard it again. Not a snapping branch this time. It was a footstep, a heavy bipedal footstep. Someone was walking parallel to me in the brush. "I am armed," I yelled, racking the bolt of the 30-06. The metallic clack was incredibly loud. "Come out with your hands visible." For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing. I remained kneeling in the mud, the cold seeping through my waterproof pants, the crosshairs of my scope desperately searching the gray void. I told myself it was a bear. Bears sometimes walk on their hind legs to get a better view. That had to be it. Then, from the impenetrable wall of fog, a voice called out. It wasn't the guttural roar of a bear. It wasn't the screech of a cougar. It was a human voice. But it was wrong. The cadence was broken, the pitch wavering unnaturally, as if a broken cassette tape were being played at the wrong speed. And the words froze the blood in my veins. Elias. It dragged my name out, hissing the syllables through the damp air. Help me, Elias. My stomach dropped into an icy abyss. The voice was high-pitched, laced with a familiar, desperate terror. I knew that voice. It haunted my nightmares every single time I closed my eyes. It was the voice of Maya, the little girl who had died of hypothermia in the Cascades 6 months ago. The girl whose body I had pulled from a snowdrift. It's so cold, Elias. Why didn't you find me? No, I gasped, stumbling backward, my boot catching on a root. I hit the ground hard, dropping the rifle in the mud. Panic, raw and unfiltered, flooded my system. No, 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 you're dead, you're gone. Elias. The voice came from a different direction now, behind me, closer. It was mimicking her. Something in the fog was wearing the voice of a dead child, like a stolen goat. The realization broke my discipline. I scrambled to my feet, snatching the muddy rifle from the ground, and abandoned all protocol. I ran with the reckless, blind terror of a hunted animal. The trail blurred beneath my boots. Branches whipped against my face, tearing at my skin, but I didn't feel the pain. The heavy backpack pounded against my spine. I could hear heavy, thudding footsteps keeping pace with me in the brush, crashing through the undergrowth with impossible speed and terrifying agility. It wasn't running on 2 legs anymore. It was moving on 4, tearing through the forest like a nightmare locomotive. I burst out of the tree line and onto the rocky clearing at the base of Watchtower 9. The metal stairs spiraled upward, slick with rain and moss. I didn't look back. I scrambled up the metal grating, my boots slipping, my breath tearing from my lungs in ragged sobs. 60 steps, 70 steps. I hit the landing, threw open the heavy reinforced door of the cabin, and hurled myself inside. I slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt, sliding the heavy iron chain into place, and backing away until I hit the far wall. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the gray sky pressing against the wraparound windows. I crouched beneath the windowsill, gripping the rifle to my chest, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I waited for the sound of claws on the metal stairs. I waited for the door to splinter. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nothing. The only sound was the wind howling around the steel struts of the tower and the relentless patter of rain against the glass. Slowly, agonizingly, I crept up and peered over the windowsill. The clearing below was empty. The forest wall was a solid, impenetrable mass of dark green and gray fog. Whatever had chased me, whatever had spoken in the voice of a dead girl, had retreated back into the abyss. My hands were shaking violently as I reached for the shortwave radio on the desk. I needed to call Port Angeles. I needed to request an immediate evac. I flipped the power switch. Instead of the usual hiss of static, the speaker hummed with a low, vibrating distortion. I grabbed the mic, pressing the transmission button. Base, this is Watchtower 9. Base, do you copy? I have an emergency situation. I need immediate extraction. Do you copy? Over? I released the button. The radio popped, crackled, and then a voice came through the speaker. It wasn't the gruff, familiar voice of the dispatcher. It was a deep, guttural sound, layered over itself, sounding like crunching bones and grinding stones. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, a harsh, ancient cadence that made my teeth ache. Then it shifted. The static cleared for just a second, and a voice, my own voice, spoke back to me through the radio. We are going to break your rules, Elias. We are going to strip you down to the meat. The radio went dead. I looked out the window at the endless expanse of the Olympic forest, realizing with a cold, absolute certainty that I was entirely cut off from the world. I was locked in a glass box, suspended in the sky, and something ancient, intelligent, and unspeakably cruel was waiting for the sun to go down. And the sun was already setting. Terror has a physical weight. It sits in the center of your chest, dense and cold, displacing oxygen and turning your blood to sludge. As I backed against the rough-hewn timber wall of Watchtower 9, my grandfather's rifle clutched against my sternum, I felt crushed by that weight. The glass-walled cabin, barely 12 feet by 12, which had been my sanctuary for months, was instantly transformed into a display case. I was a specimen, pinned against the back wall, illuminated faintly by the rapidly fading, bruised purple light of the stormy twilight. Outside, the Olympic wilderness stretched out in an endless ocean of trembling spruce and Douglas fir, now completely swallowed by the aggressive, swirling gray miasma. I counted my heartbeats to keep from screaming. 30, 60, 100. Nothing mounted the metal stairs. No heavy bulk slammed against the reinforced door. The absolute silence that had fallen over the ridge persisted, broken only by the low, hollow groan of the wind weaving through the steel lattice struts beneath me. The cabin remained a freeze frame of panicked isolation, the overturned coffee mug on the floor, the maps scattered across the desk, the radio humming with a dead, low-frequency vibration that seemed to rattle the teeth in my skull. "Break your rules," the words played back in my mind, a perfect digital echo of my own voice, but laced with a cruel, ancient resonance that my vocal cords could never produce. It was the Oz effect again, but internal. My SAR training, the years of drilling protocol, situational awareness, and emotional detachment, was fighting a losing battle against a primal, abject terror that I hadn't felt since I was a child afraid of the closet door left ajar. Protocol said, assess the situation, fortify, communicate, plan for extraction. Assess. I was trapped 70 feet in the air, miles from help, being hunted by something that could mimic the voice of a dead child and hijack shortwave radio frequencies. Fortify. I crept forward, keeping low beneath the windowsills, and turned the valve on the propane stove, silencing the hiss of the gas ring. I needed maximum auditory awareness. I checked the deadbolt on the door again, sliding my hand over the rough metal. It was secure. I grabbed the heavy-duty ratchet straps I used for securing gear during high winds and hooked them across the doorframe, tensioning them until they hummed. It wouldn't stop a determined beast, but it would buy me seconds. Communicate. I looked at the radio. My hand was shaking so badly I had to grip my wrist with the other to steady it. I flipped the power switch off, then on again. The same low-frequency hum returned. It wasn't standard static. It felt intentional, like a line was open but nothing was being transmitted. I didn't dare press the talk button again. I didn't want to hear my own voice mock me a second time. I sat on the floor, the cold linoleum seeping through my jeans, and took inventory. I had my grandfather's .30-06, 6 rounds in the magazine, a box of 20 more on the shelf. I had a flare gun with 4 flares, a survival knife, enough canned food for a week, and 5 gallons of potable water. Physically, I could hold out. Psychologically, I was already leaking oil. As the last vestige of twilight dissolved into absolute ink-black night, I realized how vulnerable I truly was. The Watchtower was designed for visibility. It was a lantern in the wilderness. If I turned on the propane lamp, I would be perfectly illuminated for whatever was out there in the fog. I would be on stage, and the audience would be invisible. I chose the darkness. Hours bled by, marked only by the obsessive ticking of the wind-up clock on the desk. The fog thickened, pressing against the 360-degree glass walls like a physical shroud. It reduced the world to a radius of 0. I sat in the center of the floor, facing the door, the rifle resting on a rolled-up sleeping bag to keep my arms from fatiguing. I must have drifted into a dissociative fugue, a state where the mind retreats from overwhelming stress. I was thinking of Maya again, not the voice in the woods, but the real Maya. I was thinking about the geometry of where I found her. She was huddled beneath a granite overhang, twisted into a tight, impossible knot to preserve body heat. The snow had covered her, creating a perfect white tomb. The geometry of death was precise, static, and final. Rules. A sharp tink against the glass shattered the silence. I jumped, my finger jerking near the trigger guard. I swept the rifle barrel to the left. It sounded like a pebble hitting the window. Tink. Another one on the opposite wall. Then tink, tink, tink. Rapidly, like hail, but irregular. I crept toward the window, the standard protocol screaming to stay put, but the need to know overrode it. I pressed my face near the glass, shielding my eyes with my hands to break the reflection. The fog was too dense to see the base of the tower, but the spotlight fixed to the catwalk railing was still powered by the battery bank. I reached out and flipped the switch for the exterior light. The beam cut a harsh cone through the mist. It was like looking into a roiling liquid gray sky. Beneath the window, stuck to the slick glass, was a clump of dark, wet earth, and stuck within the earth was a small, white river stone, perfectly round, smooth, identical to the ones in the buck's eyes. They were throwing them up here, 70 feet straight up, through heavy wind and fog, with accurate precision. I backed away, the cognitive dissonance threatening to fracture my sanity. Gravity. Gravity was a rule. You don't throw stones 70 feet straight up with accuracy. Suddenly, the shortwave radio sputtered to life. I hadn't turned it back on. The switch was physically in the off position. It wasn't hum this time, it was audio. It sounded like a recording from years ago, distorted, slowed down, then sped up. Searching quadrant 4, high winds, visual contact lost. It was a search and rescue channel. He's got a pulse, Vance. He's holding on. Maya, can you hear my voice? It was my voice. Recordings of me from different operations over the past decade. It was sampling my history, my failures, my stress. It was building a vocabulary out of my own trauma. Break your rules, Elias. Strip you down. The speaker crackled violently and popped. A thin wisp of acrid smoke curled up from the radio casing. The smell of burning electronics mixed with the stale cabin air. I scrambled forward and ripped the power cable out of the battery bank socket. The speaker fell silent, but the smell lingered, a reminder that reality was being warped around me. I needed to see it. I needed to see the monster to make it real, to fit it into a box I could understand. I grabbed the 30-06, grabbed the heavy 6-battery mag light from the desk, and approached the door. My grandfather had always said, "Fear thrives on the unknown, son. Shine a light on it, and it just becomes something you gotta deal with." I cut the external spotlight first. Darkness returned, heavier than before. Then I unscrewed the focus ring of the maglite, turning it into a powerful flooding beam. I strapped the rifle to my back, took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and unhooked the ratchet straps. I threw the door open. The cold, damp wind hit me like a physical blow. The fog rushed in, bringing with it that sweet and sour stench of sulfur and old blood. I stood on the catwalk, 70 feet in the air, suspended in a gray void. I shone the beam downward, tracing the spiral metal stairs. They descended into nothingness, the gray vapor swallowing the light after 30 feet. The gratings were slick with moisture. "I'm gun playing," I yelled into the abyss. My voice didn't echo. The fog was too acoustic absorbent. It was flat, lifeless. "Come and break the rules to my face!" Bravado. Hollow, stupid bravado. I was SAR, I was protocol, and I was falling apart. I focused the beam on the stairs again. Halfway down, the light caught something. Movement. It wasn't a bear on all fours. It wasn't a cougar slinking. It was pale, exceedingly pale, like the flesh of a fish caught in the deepest, lightless trench of the ocean. It was long, too long, its limbs articulated at impossible spidery angles. It was gripping the spiral railing with hands that were too large, the fingers elongated, wrapping around the metal like pale, fleshy vines. It was pulling itself upward, not with a climb, but with a fluid, liquid uncoiling motion. I didn't see a face, just an oval of pale, smooth flesh with deep shadowed hollows where the eyes should have been. It moved faster than gravity, flowing up the stairs with a sickening, silent speed. A specimen pinned against the wall. That thought returned with terrifying force. I didn't shoot. The rifle was on my back and my brain refused to send the signal to grab it. Instead, I retreated. I slammed the door, locked the deadbolt, threw the ratchet straps back into place, and barricaded the door with the heavy oak desk, spilling the last of my Powboy coffee and scattering my maps across the floor. I scrambled back to the far corner, pulling the sleeping bag over me, curling into the same geometry of death I had found Maya in. Rules. Maya twisted to survive. Elias Vance twisted to survive. The shortwave radio, unplugged, lying burnt on the counter, began to speak again. No speaker needed. The sound resonated directly from the metal casing. It was Maya's voice, but not scared this time. It was giggling, a child's delighted, cruel giggle. "Geometry class, Elias. Let's learn about angles." A heavy, wet thump hit the door. The reinforced metal buckled inward. One of the iron hinges shrieked as the screws were ripped from the timber frame. The ratchet straps groaned under the tension. Another thump. A crack appeared in the door, a splintered wound in the aged wood. Through the crack, the fog poured in, and something else. A pale, long finger, ending in a hooked black claw, sinuated through the opening, feeling the air, searching for the ratchet straps. Strip you down to the meat. I raised the rifle, my breath a ragged sob. I aimed at the crack in the door. The rule was, bullets penetrate flesh, bullets kill. Crack. The first gunshot in Watchtower 9 was deafening. The muzzle flash lit up the cabin in a hellish strobing light. The bullet punched through the door, through the crack, and into the void beyond. I didn't hear a roar of pain. I didn't hear a heavy bulk tumble down 70 feet of stairs. I heard the sound of that liquid uncoiling, retreating rapidly down the metal gratings, accompanied by that same echoing, bone-grinding language on the radio. I didn't move. I remained aimed at the door as the gray light of dawn slowly, excruciatingly began to seep through the fog. The storm didn't break, but the absolute darkness receded, revealing the battered state of my cabin, the fractured door, the twisted hinge, the ratchet straps humming like guitar strings. It hadn't wanted to break in, not yet. It was testing the perimeter, assessing the defenses, breaking my rules one by one, watching me through the geometry of shadows. I lowered the rifle, my arms numb. Dawn was temporary. Night would return to Blackwood Ridge, and the rules were all gone. Dawn in the Olympic Peninsula does not break, it bleeds. It is a slow, agonizing hemorrhaging of black into a bruised, sickly gray that offers no warmth and absolutely no comfort. I sat with my back against the far wall of Watchtower 9, my legs cramped and trembling, the cold metal of the .30-06 rifle resting heavily across my thighs. I hadn't slept a single second. My eyes felt like they were packed with crushed glass, and my mouth tasted of copper and stale adrenaline. As the pale light filtered through the panoramic windows, the reality of my situation crystallized with horrifying clarity. I looked at the heavy oak door. The top hinge was completely torn from the timber frame, the thick iron screws sheared in half by whatever immense, unnatural force had hit it during the night. The heavy-duty ratchet straps I had rigged were frayed, the bright orange nylon fibers snapping one by one under a tension they were never designed to hold. The door was compromised. One more strike like the one I had heard hours ago, and the barrier would fail completely. I looked at the shortwave radio on the desk. It was nothing more than a melted, blackened lump of plastic and exposed fused wiring. It was dead. I was completely, utterly cut off. In search and rescue, we live by the rule of threes. You can survive 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 hours without shelter in extreme environments, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. They drill it into your head until it becomes an automatic metric for assessing any survival situation. But sitting there, listening to the wind howling through the steel struts, I realized there was a missing addendum to the manual. There was no rule for how long a man could survive when the forest itself was actively trying to consume his mind. I couldn't stay in the tower. That was the primary conclusion my exhausted brain managed to formulate. The tower was a trap, a glass box suspended 70 feet in the air. If that pale, elongated abomination decided to climb the stairs again tonight, I would have nowhere to run. I would be cornered, firing wildly in an enclosed space until I ran out of ammunition, and then I would be torn apart. My only option, my single desperate lifeline, was the emergency hardline relay station located at Loggers Point. It was an old logging camp left over from the 1980s, roughly 7 miles southwest, through the densest, most unforgiving terrain of the sink. It had a subterranean bunker with a dedicated, heavy shielded landline that ran directly to the Port Angeles Ranger Station. It was immune to atmospheric interference and presumably supernatural hijacking. 7 miles. In normal conditions, a rigorous 3-hour hike. In this weather, with the mud and the terrain, 5 hours. With a monster hunting me, an eternity. I forced myself to stand, my joints popping and protesting in the damp cold. Protocol dictated preparation. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. I moved methodically, suppressing the rising tide of hysteria bubbling in my chest. I unrolled my heavy, waterproof tactical backpack and began loading it. I packed high-calorie ration bars, 3 liters of purified water, my extensive trauma kit, 2 flares, strike-anywhere matches in a waterproof container, a thermal emergency blanket, and my topographical map. I checked my compass. The needle seemed slightly sluggish, wavering a few degrees off true north, but it eventually settled. Next came the weaponry. I checked the action on my grandfather's Winchester 30-06. Smooth, cold, reliable. I loaded a full magazine of 5 rounds and chambered a 6th. I took the remaining box of 20 rounds and distributed them across the tactical webbing of my chest rig for easy access. Finally, I strapped my 6-inch serrated survival knife to my right thigh, the Kydex sheath clicking reassuringly. I stood by the fractured door, took a deep, shuddering breath of the stale cabin air, and gripped the handle. "Okay, Elias," I muttered to myself, the sound of my own voice startlingly loud. "Slow and steady. Check your corners. Maintain the perimeter." I unlocked the deadbolt, unhooked the ruined ratchet straps, and pulled the door open. The wind hit me instantly, carrying that same nauseating coppery stench of rot and sulfur. The fog was still incredibly thick, a shifting, milky soup that limited visibility to perhaps 20 feet. I stepped out onto the metal catwalk, my boots ringing hollowly against the grating. I kept the rifle shouldered, aiming down the sights into the gray abyss below. The descent was pure psychological torture. The metal stairs spiraled downward around the central support column. With every step, I expected a pale, many-jointed hand to shoot out from beneath the grating and wrap around my ankle. I expected the face of the creature, that smooth, featureless oval of dead flesh, to suddenly lunge up from the fog. I descended sideways, my back pressed against the cold steel railing, sweeping the rifle barrel back and forth, my finger tight against the trigger. 60 steps, 50, 40. The fog swallowed the watchtower above me, and the forest floor remained invisible below. I was suspended in a purgatory of white noise and freezing moisture. 30 steps, 20, 10. My boots finally hit the spongy, saturated earth of the forest floor. I spun around in a tight circle, leveling the rifle at the impenetrable wall of towering Douglas fir surrounding the clearing. Nothing moved. The silence was absolute. The Oz effect was still in full force. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling squirrels. The ecosystem was holding its breath, paralyzed by the presence of an apex predator that did not belong in this world. I backed away from the stairs, my eyes scanning the mud at the base of the tower. I was looking for tracks. If a massive, bipedal creature had been here, it would have left impressions in the soft earth. I found something infinitely worse. Scratched deeply into the heavy steel plating of the tower's foundational support beam were gouges. They weren't bear claws. They were long, parallel furrows that tore through a quarter-inch of industrial steel like it was wet cardboard. And piled neatly at the base of the scratched steel was a small pyramid of perfectly smooth white river stones. 7 stones in total, 1 for every mile I had to walk to reach Loggers Point. It was a message. It knew exactly where I was going. It was inviting the chase. A cold sweat broke out across my lower back. I tore my eyes away from the stones, pulled my compass from my chest rig, and shot a bearing for the southwest. I plunged into the tree line, leaving the clearing behind. The Olympic National Forest is not a place you simply walk through. It is a hostile, tangled labyrinth of old-growth timber, massive deadfalls rotting into nurse logs, and thickets of devil's club, a plant covered in brittle, toxic spines that will tear through denim and fester in your skin. The ground was slick with decomposing fern leaves and mud that sucked at my boots with every step. Within 30 minutes, I was drenched in sweat despite the near-freezing temperature. The canopy overhead was so dense that the fog was trapped beneath it, turning the forest into a claustrophobic, dimly lit tunnel. I moved as quietly as possible, utilizing the fox walk, rolling my steps from the outside edge of the foot to the toe to minimize sound. But in this dead silence, even the quietest squelch of mud sounded like a siren. 2 hours passed, my compass constantly relying on dead reckoning to stay on course, as there were no landmarks visible through the mist. Then the spatial distortions began. I was navigating around a massive, uprooted hemlock, its root system a towering wall of dirt and tangled wood. I spent 10 minutes picking my way through the surrounding briar patch, keeping the root wall to my right. When I finally cleared the obstacle and looked back to orient myself, the uprooted tree was gone. I stopped, blinking rapidly, wiping the rain and sweat from my eyes. I spun around. The landscape had subtly shifted. The trees I thought I had just passed were different. The slope of the ground felt wrong. It was as if the forest was a Rubik's Cube, and something was silently rotating the layers while I wasn't looking. "Focus, Elias," I whispered, gripping the rifle tighter. "It's the fog. It throws off your depth perception. Trust the compass. Trust the math." I looked down at the compass in my palm. The magnetic needle was spinning lazily in a slow, continuous circle. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I tapped the glass face of the compass. The needle kept spinning. North was gone. The rules of magnetism had been suspended. I was entirely blind, navigating by instinct in a forest that was actively altering its own geography. I picked a direction that felt like a downward slope. Water always flows to the lowest point, and Loggers Point was near the valley basin, and pushed forward. The physical exertion was taking its toll. My legs felt like lead, and my bruised ribs throbbed with every breath. Another hour crawled by. The silence began to feel heavy, pressing against my eardrums until they popped. I needed to hear a sound, any sound, to prove I hadn't gone deaf. And then I did hear a sound. Crunch. It was distinct. A heavy boot stepping on dry twigs. It came from directly ahead, maybe 40 yards through the fog. I dropped to a crouch instantly, sinking into the wet ferns, raising the rifle to my shoulder. I peered through the scope, but all I saw was a wall of gray and green. Crunch. Splash. It was pacing back and forth across my projected path. "Identify yourself," I yelled, abandoning stealth. If it was the creature, it already knew I was here. The footsteps stopped. A long, agonizing minute stretched out. My finger applied a fraction of a pound of pressure to the trigger. My breathing sounded incredibly loud in my own ears. Then, a voice called out from the fog. It was a man's voice. Deep, authoritative, and laced with a thick layer of radio static, even though he was standing right in front of me. Ranger Vance, this is dispatch. We have your location. Remain where you are. We are sending an extraction team. Acknowledge. Over. My heart leaped into my throat. Dispatch. It was Port Angeles. They had heard my broken transmission. They were coming. I lowered the rifle a fraction of an inch, opening my mouth to shout back. But then I froze. The voice was perfect. It sounded exactly like Greg, the night shift dispatcher. But there was no radio crackle out here in the open air. And more importantly, the cadence was entirely wrong. It was completely flat, devoid of any human emotion, inflection, or urgency. It was a recording being played back by something that didn't understand what the words meant. Remain where you are, Elias. The extraction team is hungry. Acknowledge. Over. The voice shifted on the last sentence, dropping 3 octaves into a guttural, wet snarl that vibrated the muddy water pooling around my boots. I didn't yell back. I brought the rifle up, sighted dead center on where the voice had originated, and pulled the trigger. The .30-06 roared, a thunderclap that temporarily deafened me and shattered the unnatural silence of the forest. The recoil punched my shoulder, a welcome, grounding pain. Through the scope, I saw the muzzle flash illuminate the fog, and for a split second, I saw it. Standing behind a thick curtain of hanging moss, unaffected by the bullet that had surely passed right through its position, was the creature. It was impossibly tall, its pale, hairless skin stretched taut over a skeletal frame. But it wasn't wearing a blank, featureless face anymore. It was wearing a face it had stolen from my memories. It had the wide, terrified eyes and the blue, frostbitten lips of Maya, the dead 7-year-old girl. Her face was stretched and distorted, pulled over a skull that was far too large, grinning at me with rows of needle-sharp, blackened teeth. It let out a sound, a horrific, overlapping chorus of a little girl's giggle and a dying elk's scream, and dropped to all fours. It charged. It didn't run. It moved like a spider, its elongated limbs churning up the mud, closing the distance with terrifying velocity. I racked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, the brass spinning away into the ferns. I chambered another round, acquired the target, a blur of pale flesh and a child's stolen face, and fired again. Crack! I didn't wait to see if it hit. I spun on my heel and sprinted in the opposite direction, diving into the thickest, most impenetrable patch of devil's club I could see. The toxic spines tore through my canvas jacket, ripping into my arms and face, burning like liquid fire. But I welcomed the agony. Pain meant I was alive. I crashed through the brush, blind and terrified, listening to the heavy, wet thudding of the creature leaping over deadfalls behind me. It was toying with me. It was faster than me, stronger than me, and it knew this forest intimately. It was hurting me. I burst through the thicket and suddenly found myself standing on the edge of a steep, muddy ravine. 30 feet below, a swollen, fast-moving creek roared over jagged black rocks. I heard the creature crash through the brush behind me, its sickening giggle echoing through the fog. There was no time to think. There were no protocols for this. I slung the rifle tight across my back, closed my eyes, and threw myself off the edge of the ravine, plummeting into the icy, churning black water below. Hitting the surface of the swollen creek felt like colliding with a brick wall made of solid ice. The kinetic shock punched the oxygen from my lungs, instantly replacing it with freezing, brackish water. The current didn't just carry me, it consumed me. I was caught in a chaotic washing machine of dark water and jagged river rock, my heavy canvas coat dragging me down into the crushing blackness. I fought with the pure, mindless panic of a drowning animal. My hand struck a submerged root, and I pulled with tendon-tearing desperation. My head broke the surface, I vomited river water, inhaled a ragged breath of the freezing fog, and let the current slam me into a shallow gravel bar. Hand over hand, I hauled my dead weight out of the water and collapsed onto the muddy bank. I was alive, but the relief was non-existent. I was soaking wet, exhausted, and the temperature was hovering just above freezing. 3 hours without shelter in extreme environments. My SAR training forced the analytical part of my brain to the forefront. I was entering the first stage of acute hypothermia. Uncontrollable shivering racked my torso as my body desperately tried to generate heat. I had to find shelter, and I needed fire, or I would be dead long before the monster caught me. Stumbling downstream, fighting a dangerous lethargy that begged me to just lie down and sleep, I found it, a massive, uprooted western hemlock. The root system had pulled up a sheer wall of earth, creating a natural hollow cavity protected from the rain and wind. I dragged myself inside the dusty dirt of the root cave. My hands were useless, pale and rigid like a corpse's. I fumbled with my waterproof matches, but I couldn't grip them. The matches crumbled. The hypothermia was winning. The flare gun. I dug blindly into my backpack and pulled out the heavy plastic pistol. I gathered dry, dead ferns, pine needles, and paper from my map case into a pile. Cocking the hammer with the edge of my boot, I aimed the muzzle into the tinder and squeezed the trigger. The percussive blast deafened me. A blinding 2,000-degree red magnesium flare buried itself in the dirt, instantly vaporizing the tinder. Within minutes, I had a substantial, crackling fire roaring. I stripped off my soaked coat, wrapped my reflective Mylar emergency blanket around my shoulders, and absorbed the glorious, life-saving heat. The excruciating pain in my thawing fingers was the best thing I had ever felt. It meant I was surviving. For a fleeting moment, I felt safe. Then the psychological warfare resumed. It started as a whisper, distinct from the rushing river outside my cave. The heavy, suffocating silence, the Oz effect, returned, smothering the natural sounds of the forest. Crack! A heavy footstep sounded just beyond the firelight. I grabbed my grandfather's wet .30-06 rifle, racked the bolt, and aimed it at the darkness. "I have fire," I rasped, my voice shaking, "and I have iron. Come any closer." From the absolute blackness, a shape materialized at the very edge of the illumination. It was impossibly tall and spindly, crouching on elongated limbs. Then it spoke. It didn't use distorted static this time. It used Maya's voice. Clear, intimate, like a child sitting right next to me. "The fire feels nice, Elias, but the wood is wet and the night is long." My breath hitched. "Shut up! You aren't her!" "I know what you saw when I found me in the snow," the creature whispered, the voice dripping with innocent cruelty. "I know what the cold did to my skin. It turns black, doesn't it? You let me freeze, Elias. You stopped to drink coffee in your warm truck while I was dying." The words were precision-guided missiles targeting my deepest guilt. It was pulling the exact thoughts that had tortured me for 6 months straight out of my mind and weaponizing them. "It was a level 5 blizzard!" I screamed, tears of rage and exhaustion blurring my vision. "Visibility was 0! The creature let out a horrific, overlapping giggle. "Excuses! The rules didn't save me, and they won't save you. When your fire dies and your heart stops, I am going to peel the skin from your face and wear it." It took a single, deliberate step closer. I saw a flash of pale flesh and a scythe-like claw. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the trigger. The .30-06 roared, the muzzle flash blinding me. I pumped the bolt and fired twice more into the dark, splintering wood and tearing up mud. The echoes rolled through the ravine and faded into the heavy fog. Nothing moved. I looked at my dwindling fire. The creature was right. I only had a few hours of dry wood left. After that, the cold in the dark would consume me. I could stay here and wait to die, or I could take whatever warmth I had accumulated and make a blind, desperate sprint through the forest toward the Loggers Point relay station. Elias Vance, the ASR ranger who had failed to save a little girl, was not going to die shivering in a hole. I began to pull my damp clothes back on. It was time to run. I didn't run with the tactical, measured pace of a search and rescue ranger. I ran with the blind, agonizing desperation of a hunted animal. My damp clothes clung to my freezing skin, rapidly leaching the last reserves of heat I had gained from the flare. Every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass, and my boots sank heavy into the rotting detritus of the Olympic forest floor. I didn't need a compass anymore. Fear was my true north. I followed the downward slope of the valley, crashing through the Devil's Club and deadfalls, ignoring the thorns that shredded my hands and face. Behind me, the heavy, rhythmic thudding of the creature kept pace. It was no longer hiding. It was charging through the brush, snapping thick branches like twigs, its horrific, overlapping giggle echoing through the dense fog. "Elias, it's so cold, Elias. Wait for me," it shrieked, wearing Maya's voice like a grotesque mask. "Shut up," I roared, the sound tearing from my raw throat. Through the swirling, impenetrable gray, a massive geometric shape suddenly materialized. It wasn't a tree or a boulder. It was the harsh, unnatural right angle of poured concrete. Loggers Point. The relay station was a relic of the 1980s logging boom, half buried into the side of a muddy hill. A heavy steel blast door, rusted but intact, was set deep into the concrete facade. I hit the clearing at a full sprint, my boots slipping wildly in the mud. The creature erupted from the tree line less than 40 yards behind me. I didn't look back to see its face. I could hear the wet, heavy slap of its elongated limbs hitting the earth, closing the distance with terrifying, unnatural speed. 30 yards, 20 yards. I slammed into the steel door shoulder first, the impact jarring my teeth. I grabbed the heavy iron wheel in the center of the door and hauled backward. It groaned, the rustic hinges screaming in protest, but it gave way. 10 yards. The stench of sulfur and rotting meat washed over me in a suffocating wave. I threw myself inside the pitch-black bunker and grabbed the interior handle, pulling the massive steel door shut with every ounce of adrenaline left in my system. Clang! The door met the frame just as a tremendous weight slammed into the exterior. The entire concrete structure shuddered. I scrambled backward in the dark, my hands finding the heavy steel locking bolts, and slammed them into place. 1, 2, 3. A high-pitched, deafening shriek vibrated through the steel door, followed by the furious, frantic scratching of scythe-like claws, trying to gouge through inches of solid metal. It was locked out. I was in. I collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, my back against the wall, dry heaving violently. It took me several minutes to realize I was crying. Tears of pure, unadulterated relief, mixing with the mud and blood on my face. The bunker was completely black, smelling of stale air, ozone, and old dust. I unslung the 30-06, setting it beside me, and fumbled for the waterproof flashlight attached to my chest rig. I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a small, sterile room. Cinderblock walls, a dusty metal desk, and there, sitting perfectly in the center of the desk, was the hardline emergency telephone. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking so badly they nearly gave out, and lunged for the phone. I ripped the heavy receiver from the cradle and pressed it to my ear. There was a pause, a terrifying, silent void. And then, the steady, glorious hum of a dial tone. It was a dedicated underground line. The fog and the storm couldn't touch it. I hammered the 0 key, routing directly to the Port Angeles Ranger Station emergency dispatch. It rang once, twice. "Port Angeles Dispatch, this is Greg." A gruff, utterly human voice answered. A sob caught in my throat. Greg, oh my God, this is Ranger Vance. Watchtower 9 is completely compromised. I'm at the Loggers Point relay station. You need to send a heavily armed SAR medevac immediately. There's something out here." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Vance? Jesus Christ, Elias, we've been trying to raise you for 24 hours. Your radio went dead. We thought the tower took a lightning strike. Are you injured?" "I'm freezing, Greg. Stage 2 hypothermia, but I'm secured inside the bunker. The door is bolted. I glanced back at the heavy steel door. The scratching had stopped. The creature had realized it couldn't breach the metal. You need to send a bird now. It's hostile, Greg. It's highly aggressive. Copy that, Elias. Hang tight. Greg's voice was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, the epitome of protocol and safety. We already have a Coast Guard Jayhawk in the air searching your sector. I'm patching them your coordinates at Loggers Point now. ETA is less than 10 minutes. Just stay behind that steel door, buddy. Do not open it until the rescue team secures the perimeter. I copy, I breathed, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor, the phone still pressed tightly to my ear. I'm not moving. They're coming, Elias. You survived. I closed my eyes, letting my head rest against the cold concrete. I had won. I had beaten the elements, and I had beaten the monster. The rules had held up after all. Minutes ticked by in silence. Then I heard it. Through the thick concrete walls, a low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate in my chest. Thwop, 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 thwop. The heavy, unmistakable sound of a helicopter's dual rotors cutting through the thick fog. I hear them, Greg, I yelled into the phone, standing up. They have visual on the bunker, Elias, Greg replied, his voice crackling slightly over the line. They're hovering at 60 feet, dropping 2 armed rescue medics on fast ropes now. They're going to secure the clearing. I moved toward the steel door. Embedded at eye level was a small, thick pane of reinforced ballistic glass, an observation slit. I wiped the condensation from the glass and peered out into the night. The clearing outside the bunker was bathed in a blinding, angelic beam of white light from the helicopter's searchlight. The fog swirled violently in the rotor wash. I watched as 2 heavily armored SAR medics slid down the thick ropes, their boots hitting the mud. They immediately raised their assault rifles, sweeping the tree line with professional, tactical precision. I reached for the heavy deadbolts, ready to throw them open and run out into the light, but my hand froze on the metal lever. I looked through the observation slit one more time. The medics had stopped sweeping the tree line. They were lowering their rifles. One of them, a tall man in a high-visibility jacket, took a cautious step forward and dropped to one knee in the mud, holding his hand out in a comforting gesture. I squinted against the glaring searchlight. Stepping out from the dark, impenetrable tree line, walking slowly into the blinding beam of the helicopter, was a little girl. She was wearing a tattered blue parka. Her head was bowed, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were freezing. She looked tiny, lost, and utterly terrified. It was Maya. "Hey there, sweetheart." I could faintly hear the medic's voice through the external comms feed on the phone line. "It's okay. You're safe now." "How did you get all the way out here?" My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The air was sucked from my lungs. I slammed my fist against the bulletproof glass. "No, no, don't touch her!" I screamed, my voice raw and echoing uselessly inside the concrete tomb. "Shoot it! For the love of God, shoot it!" But the bunker was soundproof. They couldn't hear me over the deafening roar of the helicopter rotors. The medic took another step toward the little girl, reaching out to wrap a thermal blanket around her small shoulders. I scrambled for the phone dangling from the desk. Greg, tell the chopper to pull up. Tell the medics to fall back. It's a trap. That's not a little girl, Greg. It's the creature. Tell them." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. When the voice replied, it wasn't Greg. The audio warped, dropping pitch, shifting into that horrific, guttural frequency of grinding bones and static. "Geometry class, Elias," the voice on the phone whispered directly into my ear. It was accompanied by the sound of a little girl's delighted giggle. "I told you, we are going to strip them down to the meat." I dropped the phone. It clattered against the concrete, the dial tone replaced by the sound of overlapping monstrous laughter. I threw myself against the observation slit, staring out into the blinding light. I watched as the little girl raised her head to look at the kneeling medic. I watched her jaw unhinge, dropping impossibly low, stretching all the way down to her chest to reveal rows of jagged, blackened teeth. The medic didn't even have time to raise his rifle before the creature's elongated, pale limbs burst from beneath the blue parka, grabbing his head and twisting it with a sickening, violent jerk. The second medic opened fire, the muzzle flashes strobing in the fog, but the creature was already moving, a blur of impossible speed and pure, ancient savagery, tearing into the rescue team as the helicopter hovered helplessly above. I backed away from the door, my hands covering my mouth, my mind finally, completely fracturing. I was perfectly safe. The bunker door was impenetrable. The deadbolts were thrown. I had followed the rules. I had secured the perimeter. And now, locked inside my impenetrable concrete box, completely isolated from the world, I had a front row seat to the slaughter I had just called down from the sky. The screaming outside the bunker eventually stopped. The helicopter, realizing the horror it was witnessing, banked hard and retreated into the fog, leaving the clearing in absolute dead silence. I sat in the dark, listening. A few minutes later, a soft, rhythmic sound began against the outside of the steel door. Dink, dink, dink. It was the sound of small, smooth river stones being tapped against the heavy metal, over and over again, waiting for me to open the door.